Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 44th video for the Old Testament survey course. In this section, we're working through the book of Jonah. Now, many people know Jonah as the fish story, or possibly the VeggieTales movie. But the book of Jonah is in the Bible as a prophetic message from God. Jonah is not a typical prophetic book where the prophet delivers oracles from God, but it still is a message from God to us. Yet it comes through a narrative story. It's not a message through Jonah, but a message about Jonah. Or really, it's a message about God through the experience that Jonah has. And it works similar to the way that the Torah and the historical books reveal God through their history. Now, some people debate whether Jonah is a fictional story made up to make a theological point, or if it's real history that actually happened, which is then used to make a theological point. Now, Jesus treated this story as actual history. So for me, that settles the matter. And in this story, in order to really get the message, we need to realize that Jonah is not the hero, but in some ways he comes off like a villain. Jonah is the anti-prophet. He resists God's purposes in his life. And Jonah's lesson and the negative example he gives helps us to see God's character and God's purposes and how they apply to our lives. Now, the book starts like a typical prophetic book saying, the word of the Lord came to Jonah. And by the way, Jonah, son of Amittai, is known from 2 Kings 14:25 as a prophet from the northern kingdom during the reign of the second king Jeroboam. But because this book is not a typical prophetic oracles, we don't know if Jonah is the author of this book or not. And the unflattering portrait of Jonah may argue against it, but we just don't know for sure. Now let's look at the organization of Jonah. The outline of this book is clearly defined by each of the 4 chapters, where Jonah is doing 4 main activities, one main activity in each chapter, in 4 distinct locations. In chapter 1, Jonah is running away from God. He is at sea on his way to Tarshish, which was the end of the known world in Jonah's day. And in chapter 2, Jonah is praying for salvation from the inside of a whale. And in chapter 3 is Jonah's reluctant obedience. He finally preaches to the city of Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. Now remember, Assyria was a brutal empire that was threatening Israel. In other words, Jonah was sent to preach to the enemies of God's people. And finally, in chapter 4, Jonah is stewing in bitterness under a plant overlooking Nineveh. He was hoping for the destruction of the city, and he was pouting when it did not happen. Now, let's examine the content of Jonah by looking at some key verses. First is chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord. This passage sets the stage for the story. Jonah is given a commission to preach against Nineveh, but he ran away. Now, this passage does not yet say why Jonah ran away. And in one sense, he should be glad to deliver a message of judgment against Israel's enemies. Remember, many of the other prophets did similar messages. But we will learn later in the book what Jonah's reasons for running away were. And this will be a very important point for the book. Next is chapter 2, verse 8. And it says, "Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. Salvation is from the Lord." Now, I'll admit that this verse is probably not central to the plot or the point of Jonah, except that it is a key part of Jonah's very important prayer for salvation. But I like the phrasing, and I think it's very profound in the larger biblical context. If we pursue idols, we miss out on the best thing possible, because only the Lord can save, and only the Lord can satisfy. Then is chapter 4, verse 2. It says, Jonah prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? This is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." Now, this passage finally tells Jonah's reason for fleeing and resisting God's commission. It's because he knew God's gracious character. Did you notice how he's basically quoting from Exodus chapter 34, verse 6? The Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness. See, he knew that God's mercy overcomes his judgment, and he did not want Israel's enemies to experience the same kind of grace that Israel received. He knew that he was Yahweh. He knew what kind of God that he was, but he did not want Nineveh to know that he is Yahweh. Then finally is chapter 4, verses 9 through 11. But God said to Jonah, "Do you have a right to be angry about the vine?" "I do," he said. "I am angry enough to die." But the Lord said, "You've been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city?" In this passage, God rebukes Jonah for his selfishness and his hypocrisy. I mean, he sounds like a baby throwing a tantrum. Jonah cared for the temporary plant more than he cared for thousands of people. Jonah cared for his personal comfort more than he cared for God's purposes to make his name known. Jonah demonstrates how God's people should not think and behave. So now, let's look at the theological themes of Jonah. The first theme I've called anti-contrast faithfulness. Let me explain this term. It's a combination of two ideas. The first idea is Jonah is being an anti-prophet. That is, he's being the opposite of a prophet. He's being a prophet by negative example. See, the book of Jonah is a subversive, kind of ironic message. It's a parody of Israel. It shows Israel not fulfilling their mission that they should be. God's people, like Jonah, care more about selfish comforts than thousands of dying souls. They care more about spite against Nineveh than for making Yahweh's name known. And they're ticked off when God's name is made known. And this message is quite a challenge and a rebuke for many modern Christians as well. If the shoe fits, wear it. And then the second idea in this theme is the idea of contrast faithfulness. Now, we've already seen this narrative device, where a person's character is highlighted by a contrast with other characters. And in this story, the sailors and the people of Nineveh, they have more of a clue than Jonah does. The pagans are more faithful to God than an Israelite prophet. The sailors show more care and compassion for Jonah than he does for them. They care more that he's going to perish than he cares that the city of Nineveh is going to perish. See, the contrast between the pagans and Jonah puts Jonah in a very bad light. And all of this serves to highlight even more the main contrast between Jonah's character and the Lord's character. Jonah doesn't care about the city, but God does. All of this is to highlight God's character as the one who loves his enemies and gives them every chance to repent. That's a very New Testament kind of message in an Old Testament book. And that brings us to the second theme, which is God's compassion and missions heart. Now, all throughout the Old Testament, going back to the promise given to Abraham at least, we see God's concern and his plan to reach and to bless every nation and people group around the world. Yes, Israel was commanded to avoid being influenced by ungodly nations, which they failed to do. But remember, they are also commanded to positively influence these nations for God, which they also failed to do. And yes, it is not until the New Testament that God's missionary activity really takes off, but his command, his plan, and his intention for all the earth is revealed very clearly in the Old Testament as well. So now, let's review. First, let's review the organization of Jonah, which is based on 4 actions that Jonah does in the 4 chapters. They are running, praying, preaching, and complaining. And let's review the themes of Jonah. They are anti-contrast faithfulness and God's missionary heart. Okay, that's all for the book of Jonah. I hope that now you see it's much more than just a fish story. It very pointedly reveals God's heart. And in the next section, we'll survey the book of Micah. Thanks for watching.